All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick Strength and Power. I've got an interesting video for you guys today. So I saw a pretty interesting Photoshop job. This was done by this Super Set Man on Instagram. I believe he has a YouTube channel as well. But what he did was he took a lot of the modern era bodybuilders and photoshopped them into a vacuum pose. Now, I believe he used Chris Bumstead's abs for a lot of these Photoshop pictures. It looks very reminiscent of Chris Bumstead in a lot of these vacuum pose shots, but I thought it was an interesting example of a vacuum pose applied to men's open bodybuilding because for the first time, I thought some of these pictures looked extremely unflattering for a men's open bodybuilder to hit a vacuum pose. And for a long time, obviously, I've been a big proponent of the vacuum pose. I think it's a fantastic pose. I think it demonstrates not only a fantastic V-taper, but great control over the midsection and just an overall sophisticated posing ability. I think it's something that not a lot of people can do. And the people that can do it, it demonstrates the ability that they have to hit these poses and control their midsection, which I think is important, especially in a division like men's open where you have the ability or you have the likelihood of really blowing out your midsection with that added size. So the Super Set Man had Phil Heath with a vacuum pose photoshopped onto Phil. Now, one of the things I didn't really like about this is the vacuum pose was made to fit the midsection. So Phil, he's got a little bit wider oblique, so the midsection itself is wide, so the vacuum pose doesn't look quite right photoshopped on. So that's why some of these pictures I think look kind of off when you look at them, because the vacuum is kind of shaped to the rest of the physique and kind of doesn't look like it fits. Now, Big Ramy, I think looks pretty decent in the front double bicep with this vacuum pose photoshopped in, but with the, I think the depth here is a little bit off as well, but with the hands on his head vacuum pose, which obviously wasn't abs and thighs from the 2020 Mr. Olympia, I think the vacuum pose is photoshopped a bit too deep to Big Ramy there. It looks kind of disgusting to look at. But this is, like I said, this is kind of the first example I've seen of a vacuum pose, or at least an imagined vacuum pose applied to a men's open bodybuilder that really didn't look aesthetic. And I think that might have a lot to do with the Photoshop job here. But let's see who else they had. They had Brandon Curry, and Brandon kind of hits, I guess he doesn't really hit a vacuum pose, but he looks good enough in his poses with the smallness of his waist. And I think he actually looks better in a crunched abdominal pose because Brandon does have such detailed abs and his waist is already so small. I think he doesn't really need the added benefit of a vacuum pose in these poses. You go through, you've got Ronnie Coleman. Again, it just looks kind of weird with the shape of Ronnie's midsection trying to apply a vacuum pose. And again, it looks like Chris Bumstead's abs to me that they're applying to every single bodybuilder. Jay Cutler already kind of hits a variation of a vacuum pose. I believe these shots are actually from the 2009 Mr. Olympia where Jay Cutler came back and reclaimed his title. And actually at that Olympia, in his front double bicep, he was already hitting a vacuum pose, but just because he's a bigger, blockier bodybuilder, it might not strike most people like a normal vacuum pose would. So Jay Cutler kind of looks about the same. Dorian Yates, I think Dorian actually looks pretty good in the front double bicep. It's the abs and thighs that really looks off to me. The way that he photoshopped the depth of the vacuum in the abs and thighs, it looks really weird. Dexter Jackson, and that just does not look right at all. I think that was just not a good Photoshop job on Dexter. Flex Wheeler again. Really weird Photoshop job. I think, again, a lot of it is just the application of that layer to these bodybuilders. And Flex, his abs and thighs are being done at an angle, and I think that kind of throws off the vacuum pose. But again, you go over Kevin Levrone, just looks kind of weird. Kai Green just looks kind of weird as well. So I just wanted to show this to you guys because while this obviously isn't the actual bodybuilder hitting the abs or hitting the vacuum pose, it was the first example of a vacuum pose that I thought did not look aesthetic at all on most of these bodybuilders, and whether or not that's just due to poor Photoshop or just a visual representation of it. I thought it was an interesting post and something I wanted to share with you guys because it was just, some of this imagery here was just very almost disturbing. Like if you go back to the Phil Heath picture where he's got his hands over his head doing the abs and thighs, that Photoshopped vacuum pose there just almost looks disturbing. It's very off-putting. So I wanted to know what you guys think in the comment section below. Do you think men's open bodybuilding would be better off if the vacuum pose was a mandatory pose? It's a discussion that we've had for a very long time about the importance of the vacuum pose, especially in classic physique. Even though it's not a mandatory pose in classic physique, that's kind of more what I've pushed it for. is the vacuum being mandatory in classic, because I think it is an important classic pose. I think it demonstrates a very unique and very practiced posing ability. So I think in classic it would make a good mandatory pose. In men's open bodybuilding, there might simply be some guys that are just simply unable to ever do a vacuum pose. Maybe no matter how hard they train for a vacuum pose, they could never put their physique almost in reverse in that direction. So while I think it would be cool to apply a mandatory vacuum pose to men's open bodybuilding, because I think it would be very hard for a lot of people to do, I think there would simply be some bodybuilders that would not be able to do that because their physique has progressed to a point where it's that big, or their midsection might be that big, that they just couldn't work backwards to train for a vacuum pose. And again, the vacuum pose does not look good on every bodybuilder. And I think this Photoshop example, while it might be not the best Photoshop work, it shows that the vacuum pose doesn't necessarily make every bodybuilder look more aesthetic. Again, I think some of these might be a bad representation. But the vacuum pose, I do believe, is important for classic physique. Maybe not so much for every men's open bodybuilder. A bodybuilder that has pulled off the vacuum pose really well is, of course, Rolly Winkler. You go to Google, type in Rolly Winkler vacuum pose. I think most of these are circa 2018, 2019. Rolly Winkler is a mass monster men's open bodybuilder that has been able to do a very good job of controlling his midsection and, of course, hitting that vacuum pose. So if Rolly was able to do it, maybe other men's open bodybuilders would be able to do it. Here's a picture of Regan Grimes, left or right. And then another men's open bodybuilder that was able to correct his midsection issues and be able to pull off a vacuum pose as a relatively large open bodybuilder. Ben Pekulski did a really good job of the vacuum pose. So maybe these pictures just aren't a good representation of what the vacuum pose could be in men's open bodybuilding. But I thought these pictures were so interesting, it would be an interesting topic for a video. And I thought it would generate some really interesting discussion in the comment section down below. So let me know your thoughts on A, these pictures, the Photoshop work in these pictures. B, should the vacuum pose be a mandatory pose in men's open bodybuilding? Why or why not? Do you personally like the way the vacuum pose looks? Why or why not? And then should the vacuum pose be a mandatory pose in classic physique? Why or why not? I think there's going to be some really interesting discussion in the comment section of this video, and that's why I wanted to make it. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please give it a thumbs up if you did enjoy it. Please subscribe to the channel if you have not subscribed yet already. As always, I love you guys. Appreciate you guys. Nick Strength and Power, signing out. Shout out to the Superset Man for the Photoshopped pictures.